Hello everyone and welcome. I'm Oliver Mantell, Director of Evidence at the Audience Agency, and I'm joined here by various colleagues, but sort of co-presenting with me is my colleague Elise as well. Yeah, there you are, just waving if you've got you can see the camera. So it seems quite appropriate that at this sort of Christmas shopping time of year, we're going to be talking about shops and cafes, and looking at what audiences are telling us about what people are doing or thinking in terms of shopping, particularly in a sort of bit of a post-COVID kind of, or subsequent to earlier waves of COVID response to that. So we'll be talking through a few of the sort of findings that we've got from that in terms of each of those, in terms of shops and cafes, but with a little bit of a sort of a flavour around family audiences, and also a flavour a little bit around sort of environmental priorities for shops and cafes as well. So we'll just do the usual format, do a couple of short little bits presenting from us, a little bit of a kind of reflection on what some of this stuff might mean. Unfortunately, one of our colleagues is down with the lurgy, so that'll be from me instead. And then a chance for you to share your thoughts on the topic and your experiences as well. So that would be really great to hear about what you're finding, how things are going, and so forth. So just in terms of practicalities, before we dive straight in with the main bit, is just to say that if you want the sort of captioning, it's available in the bar at the bottom, and for purposes of audio description, I'm a white blonde male sitting in a fairly white room, and Elise, I'll let you describe yourself rather than me do it for you.
Hello, thank you. My name is Elise. I'm researcher at the Audience Agency in the evidence team, and for the audio description, I'm a white woman with short black hair, wearing a turtleneck.
Okay, well let's get underway and have a little bit of a look at what we're seeing. So this is all taken from the Cultural Participation Monitor, which is our nationally representative survey of the whole population. Obviously, not everyone's answered the survey, but a representative sample of the whole population, and it's designed to be weighted by region, by age, by gender, by ethnicity, and also by audience spectrum, which is our profiling tool. So it should be a pretty broad spread of the whole population, and we can see not just what super enthusiastic attenders are thinking, but also kind of the wider group as well. So I think first up it will be Elise looking at who's buying, who's coming back, and what some of those shifts are.
That's right. So this first section is who's buying, and especially for whom they are buying. So looking at gift shop purchases in arts, cultural, or heritage sites, not just any old shop. So this was one of the questions we asked in the monitor. And you have the options here that were given as choices on the right-hand side. Were they buying for themselves, for children they were visiting with, or children they were not visiting with, or an adult or adults they were visiting with or not visiting with? And it was a multi-choice question, so they could pick however many they wanted. And the question for phrasing was specifically thinking back to the last time you bought something from a gift shop at an arts or cultural or heritage site, who did you buy for? And so really the main headline, which we reported on when we did our key findings event and reporting, is really people are buying for themselves quite a lot. And this maybe could be surprising because you think of a gift shop as a place to buy gifts for other people, but turns out you can also buy gifts for yourself, and it's quite nice. But we did see that this was changing quite a bit depending on age. As you can see here at the bottom, this is who people bought for depending on their age profile. And we can see that red line, which is buying for themselves, declining pretty much steadily with age. And there's this little bump for people buying for children they're visiting with. And that we can see with the chart on the top that is really related to the ages where you're more likely to have a family. At the top there, you see the bar, the group of bars on the left, no dependent children under 20 in the household, a lot more likely to buy for themselves, very unlikely to buy, a lot less likely to buy for children or even other people. Whereas all the groups are on the right-hand side are divided by whether they have children and what are the ages of the children. And there we can see some more differences where the younger the children are, the more likely it is that the parent will buy them something from the gift shop. So that might be just something that could be a useful bit of information when you're thinking about, if you are an organization that has a gift shop, thinking about who buys, and obviously this might change from venue to venue, but this is just generally, again, population-wide, what people are telling us. Yeah, as I said, most people are buying for themselves. In fact, 41% only bought something for themselves. So as I mentioned, this was a multi-choice question, but just for extra context, there are some people buying for themselves and other people, and there are 41% of the entire sample who only bought something for themselves only. Now, another way to look at this split, we're seeing quite a lot of differences between families and non-families. And I didn't include it here, but we saw some differences compared to if people have been better off or worse off since the start of the pandemic. And so we wanted to include this in this analysis as well. So we split this family group into those who said they were feeling better off since the start of the pandemic, or those who are saying their financial situation has worsened since the start of the pandemic, since before the pandemic, sorry. Now, I included this little table in the corner, in the left-hand corner, to explain this, to kind of show who are these groups we're talking about and what percentage of the whole sample, essentially the whole population they're representing. And again, better or worse off means compared to pre-pandemic situations. So it doesn't necessarily mean they're the more wealthy ones or less wealthy ones, but it's just a relative position compared to before. So in the whole sample, we had 8% who were families that reported to be better off, and 14% who were families who were reporting to be worse off. And conversely, non-family groups, 13% who were reporting being better off, and 32% of the whole sample were not families and reporting to be worse off. This is, of course, ignoring a whole other subset of the population who said that their financial situation stayed the same. But for the sake of showing a clearer picture and focusing on groups of the population where there was some change, we only included those four categories. So this groups we're looking at, this table here in the corner, represents about 2/3 of the whole population in our sample, in our study. All that to say, when we get to that chart on the right there at the bottom, if we look at who those four groups bought for, we can really see quite clearly that the pattern goes with family groups. They keep the same pattern of buying more for their children, but the better off families bought more for themselves than the worse off families. 44% buying something for themselves and 30% for the worst off families. And of course, the non-family groups, whether better or worse off, were a lot more likely to buy for themselves. And it's not a huge difference really between the ones who are better off and the ones who feel worse off, 62 to 58%. Another interesting thing is, I didn't include it here visually, but I can tell you that in terms of what I was talking about before, where they were buying just for themselves or for multiple people, themselves plus somebody else, or a children and an adult that they're visiting with, it's actually the two family groups that buy for more than one type of person, more than one category in our question, rather than, you could imagine maybe just the people who are who feel better off, who have more disposable income, they're going to be more likely to buy more. But it skews more towards families. Now, of course, we don't know the quantity that was bought or the monetary value, but just from what we can tell in terms of buying for more than one category, it definitely skews towards families rather than towards relative financial situation. So that's sort of just generally the picture of who buys for whom, with this dominance of buying for yourself and then really for family groups buying for children. Now, if we take those same four groups and look at a different question we asked in the monitor, which is, in the future, do you expect that you would be more or less likely to buy from a gift shop or to visit a cafe in 4 different types of arts and heritage sites? So we had in a film venue, for a live performance, for indoor galleries or outdoor historic parks. This is up here in the corner, the 4 categories, and they correspond to these 4 bars that we have in all these charts. So we're showing you the net percentage more likely minus less likely. So essentially it's kind of showing which one is dominant, and the bars under 0 indicate that they're less likely, essentially. So you have in gray the benchmark. So that's just overall, over the whole sample, what are people saying? And again, we touched on this in the key findings, that people feel they are much less likely than before to buy from a gift shop, and less likely, but to a lesser extent, to visit cafes. And so we applied this to our 4 categories there in our table. And what it showed us really is that those family groups, that the better off groups, whether family or non-family, are overall more likely to keep buying from gift shops. Obviously, the bar is still negative, but it's much less so than those who feel worse off. And in terms of visiting cafes, some of the bars are actually positive, so they feel more likely than before to visit cafes if they feel better off since before the pandemic, now compared to pre-pandemic times. So what this is showing us is that the current financial situation people are in is going to have a bigger impact on whether they feel like they will continue visiting gift shops and cafes in the near future. In the year to come, I think, was the question we asked. But conversely, those 4 groups, if we look at it in terms of who's actually been attending in the last year, in the following slide here, we can see that it skews the other way, where it's the 2 family groups there in green and yellow who have been attending more. There's an average of 81% across all categories. I'm so sorry, I forgot to include the legend in here. The bars still represent the same thing as before. The first bar is film, and then it's performing arts, then it's indoors heritage and museums, and then it's outdoor historic parks and heritage sites. So this is what people have actually been attending in the last year, and the families average to about 81%, and the non-family groups average 63%. So we have this dichotomy where family groups are more likely to attend, but the better off groups are more likely to spend during their visit. So this is just kind of a broad piece of context to keep in mind potentially when thinking about shops and cafes, maybe in your institution, maybe if you're working with other institutions, and a trend to potentially follow in the coming months to see how that evolves and what consequences this is going to have for the sector. We could have a break for questions on this, or we could keep them all, maybe put them all in the chat, and if you have any, and then we'll tackle those at the end. I'm going to pass the mic back to Ollie.
Thank you. I love the way that in that first bit you can really in the chart you can see the little tug on the sleeve as the age groups. It's like, oh, buy me something. Oh, okay, here we go.
Absolutely.
Gradually as they get older, you can see where the influence drops, and it's like, no, buy it yourself. So great. So it's nice having that kind of separation between. We've done lots of work tracking who's going back to venues, but actually seeing not just who's going back, but who's going back and then going into the various sort of enterprise areas and varies. So the other key topic that we've started to look at in relation to retail, and I should probably actually say at this point that this bit of the cultural participation monitor was supported by the Association of Cultural Enterprises, who were our partner on the monitor this time, which is partly given this given the focus, because we discussed with them what they thought their members would be most keen to hear. And one of the key topics was about environmentalism and sustainability, and actually that's something that's become increasingly prominent. So we asked a range of questions, trying to elicit a sense of what kinds of, how important that was to different groups, whether they were sort of responsive to that offer, and indeed whether they would pay more for it, because often you're having to buy slightly more expensive stock that maybe has a slight premium on it, and to what extent can you do that before their kind of cost aversion kind of kicks in. Of course, anything involving attitudes to price, you have to be super careful, because we can't necessarily assume that someone saying in a survey, yes, I would pay 10% more, is quite the same as them actually in practice paying 10% more. But it does at least give us a sense of at least kind of relative propensity on different factors. So that's sort of just by way of a little bit of context. The other thing we asked, partly to support the planning of offers for cafes, was the types of things people were looking for on the menu, which maybe of interest as well. So let's start off with the overall picture in terms of propensity to pay for sort of green alternatives. We asked people the question, if there was something you wanted to buy, would you be prepared to pay more for a sustainable alternative by this amount, up to 10% more, 10 to 20%, or 20 to 50% or more, or not. And potentially a kind of broadly positive finding was that most people were prepared to countenance the idea of paying a little bit more for a greener version. 58% of people saying that. So that does suggest a kind of a fairly widespread awareness of the desirability of more sustainable alternatives. And we asked a follow-up question for those people who said they weren't prepared to pay more, to say, well, if it was the same price and you had the choice, would you rather have the sustainable version? Do you really not care? Or would you actively prefer to have the version that wasn't sustainable? This is where we got what I think is an entertaining result, in that there was a hardcore 5% of people who would actively prefer to have a less sustainable version. So there we are, you can't please everyone. However, about half of those people who said they wouldn't pay more for a green or sustainable alternative did nonetheless say, actually, all things being equal, I'd rather have it than not. So that's bringing it up to well over 2/3 of the population who at least have some kind of preference for sustainable offers. So far so good. That's kind of pretty positive. However, the proportion who were prepared to spend substantially more, and we did give sort of example prices, like if something was £10, it might cost 12 to 15. The proportion who said that was relatively small, 1 in 9 people. So I guess the broad headline there then is about, people may be prepared to spend more, but don't push it. Don't go too, don't think that gives license to really go too far. But also it was quite interesting to note which people said they were prepared to spend more relatively, because the proportion was very substantially higher for younger people, where there's obviously a much higher salience of the idea of environmentalism being really important, but also higher for families. And we'll see sort of that echoed again later. So more of a priority for family audiences, particularly with the youngest children, whether that's partly about wanting to make sure that what you give them is as healthy as possible, might be part of it. It might also be about kind of modeling certain values or behaviors. It might also be younger children tend to be young. Parents of younger children will tend to be younger on average and therefore more likely to fit the younger profile. But also people in lower engaged groups, typically lower engaged groups, were actually above average for being prepared to spend more, which is quite interesting because normally you would expect lower engaged groups tend to have lower average incomes, therefore you would expect more price sensitivity. But we weren't seeing that, so that's maybe something to note. So that gives a bit of an impression that widespread but far not universal preference for green alternatives, relatively small minority prepared to go in that direction. It's also worth noting when we look at the people who said that they weren't prepared to pay more, that actually some of those were non-attenders. So, effectively people who don't go to arts and cultural events, even though we were seeing very large portions of the whole population had attended in the last 12 months. 2/3 of those who wouldn't pay more for sustainable alternatives were in that category. And this was a relatively older group as well. And often they were feeling worse off post-pandemic. So again, you can see how if you put all those factors together, that might make people a bit more reluctant. That also suggests then that our core audiences on average are more likely to be more sort of motivated in favour of sustainable versions, particularly when we think about the impact on attendance post-COVID, where some of those older groups are attending in lower volumes than they previously were. So again, all of that will kind of start to push in this direction. So if that was the overall picture in terms of overall attitudes toward green alternatives, this is where we ask specifically about if you're looking at the menu in a cafe, what kind of things do you look for? And I think the key takeaway for me here is that they kind of, if like the standard options aren't that standard, in that almost half the population, or 40+% of the population, were looking for at least one of these different types of, whether it's locally sourced ingredients or it's a particular dietary preference. And nearly 1 in 3 people looking for dietary preferences of one type or another. So I think that really flags to an extent which I think we probably know instinctively, but maybe haven't thought about it being quite this widespread, that really having a full range of offers available, particularly because if one person in a group can't attend, then the whole group can't attend, is really important. Now, highest of these dietary preferences, perhaps unsurprisingly, was vegetarianism. And it's one of those things that is kind of obvious when you think about it, but vegetarianism isn't just about catering to kind of the urban middle class, albeit they are more likely to be vegetarian, but it's also about being sort of more broadly inclusive in terms of much higher proportions of Asian British people being vegetarian, for example. And also it tends to skew younger, it tends to skew female, as you would probably again expect. So again, depending on who the target audience is, that becomes increasingly important. That's significant proportions for a range of other different types of dietary requirement. Now, one thing we wondered was, we've got various different measures that we've looked at that all kind of impact on or relate to environmentalism in different ways. So we've talked about people wanting local and ethically sourced ingredients. We've talked about people being prepared to spend more for sustainable alternative produce, things in the shop. And we've talked about whether people are vegetarian or vegan. And all of these, if you were, at least hypothetically, if someone was being sort of highly motivated by environmentalism and highly consistent and whatever, you might expect there to be some substantial overlap between these categories. Not necessarily total, but substantial. Now what we saw, we made a little Venn diagram of these 3 different factors. This diagram is going to get increasingly complicated in amusing ways in a second, but as a starting point, nice clear picture. There's a bit of overlap between them, but actually there's very little overlap in the middle, really. People by and large are belonging to different ones of those categories, rather than much in the space between them. There are lots of people saying they're prepared to pay more, as we saw previously, but by no means, is that the majority of all the other groups as well. So we see some different concentrations, and relatively few people who aren't at least hitting one of these factors. So at least one of these elements that you might consider to be kind of linked to sustainability is applying to 2/3 of people. However, we can see that the people that fit in these different combinations vary quite substantially. So the groups at the top, if you like, will tend to be younger. So those who are vegetarian in general, those who are prepared to pay more, we saw tended to be younger, and the overlap between them absolutely, especially so. And that 9% overlap group is quite interesting because they had some quite strong behaviours in all sorts of ways, which we'll come back to. Those who are looking more for ethical and locally sourced stuff, on average, tended to be older, which again might be surprising. You would maybe have assumed that it would go along with some of the other measures, but it does tend to push the other direction. But family audiences, as we saw, had to pay more, and that funny little orange group there in the middle, the overlap between vegetarian and vegan and prepared to pay more, really high concentrations of family audiences, and quite highly engaged family audiences as well. Now, of course, those who aren't prepared to pay more are likely to feel worse off. It's kind of, if you feel worse off, you're likely to be less prepared to pay more. So we do see a bit of a split in that direction. But the next bit is where I think we've got an interesting little paradox on our hands, or at least something which is quite revealing when we look at the patterns between it. So some of these groups are more likely to be highly culturally engaged. So it's more likely to have said they've done any cultural engagement in the last 12 months, said they've been to all sorts of very specific art forms in the last 12 months. And generally speaking, that's in the groups who said they're prepared to pay more for sustainable things. So again, it's another sign that there's maybe slightly less price resistance amongst our core audiences than maybe there would be more generally. So far so good. But if we look at who says that they're very interested in arts and culture as a kind of interest, we get a slightly different set of groups. So we tend to get these three groups in the middle, where there's the cultural interest, there's more of a strong alignment with these kind of who might say concept-based things about being motivated by ethical and local produce, or by the idea of being vegetarian. But where we see a difference is that there's a whole load of people who are turning up to do things despite being less motivated by arts and culture as a prime condition. And that's this big red block at the top. So there's loads of people in the kind of what you might call the sort of like the middle of the audience, or sort of middle Britain, who do care about sustainability, will turn up and will spend more for sustainable produce, despite the fact they're not necessarily super culturally motivated. So that's something if you're managing to reach a really kind of broad audience, that's probably where they're then going to start to filter into. On the flip side of that, the group that is very interested in culture but not as likely to be turning up at the moment is in this overlap between those who would pay more and do care about ethical local things, but as we saw, they tend to be a little bit older. And that what's happening there is you've got some of these sort of really highly engaged older groups that we've seen dropping out of arts attenders as a result of the post-pandemic situation, where they potentially have got money, they would spend it, they could spend it, they're interested, but maybe they got out of the habit, maybe their sort of like overall attendance is down. And that, just as we've seen that through lots of the attendance data, we can also see it kind of spilling out into very particular data, even when we're looking at very specifically an issue like this. And again, that suggests that you'd end up with a bit more of a skew in terms of engagement towards some of those other groups, some of those, maybe a higher proportion of vegetarians attending than you would have had pre-pandemic, etc. So essentially what this is trying to show is how all of these different factors that we're seeing impacting attendance are interlocked, But also, I think it highlights a couple of things to me. One is that, so we've got this difference between who's coming back, who's spending. So you've got some contrast there. And it's not just enough to be looking at who's coming through the doors or kind of tracking the profile of the overall audience if you want to see how that's likely to convert into the profile of people who are spending. That when we look at who's going to the gift shop, who's buying, when they're browsing, what's going through their head, it's worth being aware of the differences of some of these sort of demographic factors, and or sort of these kind of background financial feelings about things will affect who people are thinking about when they're browsing. You know, what kind of things appeal to them, what kind of shopping experience they're after, etc. So there's something about recognizing the difference in people within those needs. There's recognizing that people's attitudes to environmentalism are widespread, possibly a little bit what we refer to as sort of light green, you know, not fully imprinted across the whole population to a really high extent. You know, lots of people think they should do something, but maybe, you know, there's a limit on that. But also that it's relatively complex. You know, people are not simple, purely logical creatures, and so it's worth bearing in mind that people might care about one thing, but maybe that doesn't mean necessarily they care about everything else. And finally, just to say that clearly, we can see the continuing importance of families as a kind of driver of engagement post-pandemic, and we think that's playing through into retail and retail preferences as well. So hopefully, some of these figures also help kind of shape what that family offer might look like. So there you are. So that's a bit of a run through of a few things that we've seen. We would love to hear a bit more about your thoughts, your reflections either on what we've said or on how things are going, or what you think key trends are, or indeed if there are key things you think it'd be great to know more about this, maybe that's something they can ask about in future. Do please share your thoughts.